From the night Soviet troops stormed a palace and assassinated the very ally they swore to protect, to the moment a single American shoulder-fired missile started knocking Soviet helicopters out of the sky like they were kites, to the morning the most feared army on the planet simply walked away, beaten by men in rubber sandals in the harshest mountains on Earth. This is the Soviet-Afghan War explained. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the second greatest military power in history lost a war it never should have started, and why that defeat helped bring the entire country down with it. December 1979. Kabul was cold, quiet, and about to explode. Let's rewind a bit. Afghanistan in the late 1970s was a poor, mountainous, deeply conservative country. Most of the population lived in villages, followed centuries-old tribal and Islamic traditions, and had zero interest in foreign ideology. But in 1978, a group of Afghan communists staged a coup, the so-called SAR Revolution, and seized power, promising to modernize the country by force. Land reform, mandatory literacy, gender equality — sounds great on paper. But they tried to do in months what would take generations, and they did it by bulldozing centuries-old religious traditions along the way. It was basically like trying to renovate your grandmother's kitchen while she's still cooking in it. She's not going to like it, and she's going to fight back with a wooden spoon. The backlash was immediate. Uprisings broke out across the country, and the increasingly isolated Afghan communist government clung to the only ally it had, the Soviet Union, right there to the north. Except Moscow didn't trust the guy in charge. The Afghan president at the time, Hafizullah Amin, was unstable, brutal even by Soviet standards, and the Kremlin started suspecting he was secretly flirting with the United States. At that point in the Cold War, that was unforgivable. So the Kremlin made a decision that would change the history of two nations. They decided to invade Afghanistan, officially to help a socialist ally, but in practice to install a more reliable puppet and make sure the country never slid toward the American side. On December 27, 1979, Soviet KGB special forces, disguised in Afghan uniforms, stormed the Tajbek Palace in Kabul. Inside was Hafizullah Amin, the same leader the Soviet Union supposedly went there to protect. He was having dinner when the assault began. In under 90 minutes, Amin was dead, along with much of his family. Soviet troops installed a new leader, Babrak Karmal, who wasn't even in Afghanistan at the time. He was waiting safely across the border, ready to be flown in the moment the dirty work was done. Within days, more than 80,000 Soviet soldiers crossed the border. Tanks, heavy artillery, air power, the full package of the largest communist army on the planet. They thought it would be quick. They thought they'd be welcomed as liberators, roll through the major cities, prop up the puppet government, and be home in a few months. Big mistake. Soviet planning, in fact, called for an operation lasting a few months at most. The generals in Moscow genuinely believed that showing force, stabilizing the capital, would be enough for the rest of the country to fall in line on its own. They were about to learn, the hardest way possible, that knowing a map and knowing a country are two completely different things. Here's the thing about Afghanistan that almost every foreign power learns the most painful way possible. This country has destroyed empires before. The British tried to conquer it in the 19th century, not once but 3 times, and walked away humiliated every time. It's no accident the place became known as the graveyard of empires. Soviet Afghanistan was not a conventional battlefield. It was a landscape of narrow gorges, mountains over 16,000 feet high, isolated villages linked by trails that predated any Soviet map by centuries. Soviet tanks, designed to roll across the plains of Central Europe in a war against NATO, found themselves trapped in mountain passes where a single man with an old rifle could ambush an entire column. And that is exactly what started happening. Groups of Afghan fighters, the Mujahideen, those who struggle, began organizing across the country. They were farmers, shepherds, religious students, tribesmen. No uniforms, no unified command structure. Many barely had decent rifles when they started. But they knew every rock in those mountains like they knew their own faces. Think about the difference in perspective here. For a 19-year-old Soviet soldier drafted from somewhere in Siberia or Ukraine, that terrain was a hostile, unfamiliar maze with no apparent logic. For a Mujahid, every rock, every bend of a river, every goat trail was childhood memory. One of them was fighting on a map, the other was fighting at home. And there's a brutal difference between those two things. The Soviets tried to fight this war the only way they knew how: brute force, air power, massive artillery. They bombed entire villages suspected of sheltering Mujahideen. They used Mi-24 attack helicopters, nicknamed flying tanks, to sweep the countryside with machine guns and rockets. But you cannot bomb an insurgency into extinction when it can simply melt into the mountains, regroup, and resurface 200 miles away. Every village destroyed created more orphans, more widows, more men with exactly one reason left to live: revenge. With every bomb that fell, the Soviets weren't eliminating the enemy, they were manufacturing the next one. Soviet troops also planted millions of landmines across Afghan territory, many of them disguised as colorful toys, specifically designed to maim rather than kill. The logic was cold and calculated. A dead fighter is a problem solved, but a wounded fighter or a mutilated child drains resources, demands care, and grinds down an entire community's morale for years. Decades after the war ended, those mines were still killing and maiming Afghan civilians who hadn't even been born when the war started. That's not the kind of thing any military strategist should be proud of, and it's not the kind of thing any population forgets or forgives. And while all this was happening, something else was taking shape behind the scenes, something that would completely transform the course of the war. Let's pause the timeline for a second, because there's a figure in this war who deserves special attention: Ahmad Shah Massoud, later known as the Lion of Panjshir. Massoud was the son of an Afghan army officer, an engineering student before the war, a man who could quote Persian poetry as easily as he could plan an ambush. He wasn't a fanatic screaming slogans. By every account from people who knew him, he was calm, strategic, almost philosophical about the war he was waging. And he chose the Panjshir Valley, a narrow, strategically vital mountain corridor, as his personal fortress. The Soviets launched no fewer than 9 major military offensives to take that valley between 1980 and 1985. 9. And every single time, Massoud simply pulled his forces up into the higher mountains, let the Soviets occupy an empty valley, and then hit them again the moment they withdrew. He never actually lost control of that territory, not once in nearly a decade. I have to admit, as guerrilla strategy goes, that's about as perfect as it gets. And here's the irony: Massoud never saw himself as just a soldier. He read constantly, wrote long, reflective letters to his commanders, and later Western journalists who interviewed him were surprised to find not a fanatic, but a calm, almost melancholic man discussing military strategy with the same ease he discussed philosophy. The Soviets had a spy satellite, top-tier military intelligence, and the firepower of an empire. And they still spent 5 years chasing, unsuccessfully, one single man through a mountain range. Rest easy was never an option for him. He spent nearly a decade never sleeping in the same place 2 nights in a row. Now we get to the point that turned this war from hard for the Soviets to impossible. Through the mid-1980s, one of the Soviets' biggest advantages was total control of the sky. The Mi-24 helicopters terrorized the Mujahideen, striking villages and guerrilla columns with almost no effective defense against them. But in 1986, the United States, through the CIA, in an operation called Operation Cyclone, along with support from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, began supplying the Mujahideen with a weapon that changed everything: the Stinger, a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile. That missile, carried on the shoulder of a single fighter, could bring down helicopters and even aircraft from miles away. For the first time in the war, the sky stopped being a Soviet sanctuary. In the months that followed, dozens of Soviet aircraft fell from the sky. Pilots who used to fly with total impunity now had to fly higher, faster, avoiding predictable routes, which drastically cut down the accuracy of their strikes. Imagine being a Soviet pilot in 1987. A year earlier, you flew low and easy, firing rockets at anything that moved beneath you, knowing nobody could touch you. Now, every time you take off, there's a real chance that some guy hiding behind a rock with a fiberglass tube on his shoulder pulls a trigger and your helicopter becomes a fireball falling out of the sky in seconds. That changes the mentality of everyone flying, and it did. The Stinger didn't win the war by itself, but it broke something psychological inside the Soviet military: the feeling of invulnerability. and once that feeling breaks, it never fully comes back. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, the numbers were becoming impossible to disguise. Over the 10 years of war, roughly 15,000 Soviet soldiers died in Afghanistan, and more than 35,000 were wounded. That's not even counting the Afghans. The war is estimated to have killed over 1 million Afghan civilians and fighters, and forced roughly 5 million people to flee the country as refugees. 5 million, in a country that had barely 15 million people to begin with. And the financial cost was eating away at the already fragile Soviet economy from the inside, like termites in wood. Soviet soldiers, many of them 18 and 19-year-old conscripts, came home. When they came home at all, psychologically shattered, addicted to cheap Afghan opium, and greeted by a government that preferred to pretend the war wasn't even happening. The coffins, when they arrived, were often buried without any public ceremony, with no mention in the official press of which war had killed that young man. There was even a grim nickname for those sealed zinc coffins coming back across the border: Cargo 200. Think about that. Your son goes off to a war the government won't even officially admit it's fighting, and comes home inside a sealed metal box you're not even allowed to open to say goodbye. Entire families started refusing to send their sons into military service, bribing doctors for fake medical exemptions, hiding young men in basements during conscription sweeps. Public trust in the Soviet military, which had been almost sacred for decades after the victory in World War II, started cracking in public for the first time. And when an army loses the faith of the very people it's supposed to represent, it has already lost the war, even if nobody said it out loud yet. And here's the bitterest twist in this whole story. The very Soviet leader who inherited this war and finally tried to end it, Mikhail Gorbachev, publicly called the conflict the Soviet Union's bleeding wound. But here's the real irony. The US was funding the Mujahideen specifically to try to inflict on the Soviet military the same kind of humiliating defeat the Americans themselves had suffered in Vietnam a decade earlier. It was geopolitical revenge, plain and simple. It worked a little too well. Afghanistan became the Soviet Vietnam, except in many ways even more devastating, because this war didn't just bleed Soviet military pride. It bled the very system holding the Soviet Union together, at a moment when that system was already cracking from economic stagnation and political pressure. And among the people the Soviet Union indirectly helped arm, train, and strengthen during this war, through the international network supporting the Mujahideen, was a wealthy young Saudi who traveled to Afghanistan to join the resistance, Osama bin Laden. The Soviet Union unknowingly helped plant the seed of a conflict the entire world would still be feeling decades later. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier, General Boris Gromov, walked back across the Friendship Bridge into Soviet territory, on foot, alone, while cameras rolled to capture the moment. No victory to celebrate, no triumphant parade, just withdrawal. The Soviet Union had sent its most powerful army, its best military technology, and lost to farmers and shepherds organized into irregular bands in the mountains. Less than 3 years later, in December 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. Coincidence? Historians disagree on exactly how much Afghanistan contributed to the Soviet collapse. The economy was already falling apart for other reasons long before the invasion. But almost nobody disagrees that this war accelerated the process, draining resources, killing public trust in the system, and exposing to the entire world that the Soviet military giant had feet of clay. In the end, this isn't just a story about tanks against mountains or an empire against guerrillas. It's a story about the limits of brute force against the human will to defend one's own land. The Soviet Union went into Afghanistan believing it could bend an entire country to its will through force. 10 years and tens of thousands of deaths later, it walked out having learned in the most expensive way possible that there are places on this earth that simply refuse to be conquered. The graveyard of empires got one more name carved into its headstone. And while the world watched the Soviet army come home defeated, nobody yet imagined that, just a few years later, it would be another superpower's turn to walk into those same mountains, promising to write a different story. But that's a war for another video. From the CIA secretly arming a rebellion on the other side of the world, to towers falling in New York, to American troops walking into those exact same Afghan mountains 20 years later, this is the story of how the United States entered the longest war in its history. If you thought the Soviet defeat was painful, click the video right here and subscribe.